In today's video, I'll present you a list with some hopefully interesting behavioral questions when it comes to mid to senior types of finance roles, and just a few house cleaning items before I begin. So the first thing you should understand, this is not the beginning of a preparation for a behavioral interview, but rather, a way to measure yourself on how good you are with these things. The beginning of a preparation should start somewhere, with preparing your stories, brainstorming for stories, looking up the company that you're applying for, and various other steps. The other thing, I'm assuming that you'll know by now about the STAR method, and it should go without saying that you should employ it wherever possible. And probably the third before I begin is that these questions, I try to frame them a little bit more interestingly when it comes for a finance role. And I know it's not usually the questions that change for more senior roles, but the way they're asked that changes. So I also try to embed this into the conversation. Of course, you'll find this in the video description as well, but I thought it'd be interesting to go through them rather quickly by categories, so I give you my 2 cents on each of these. The first one you'd want to take into account is what are some long-range objectives that you developed in your last job? What did you do to achieve them? And this refers to your ability to see the big picture, to think big, if I were to quote Amazon's leadership principle. Needless to say, it's a pretty straightforward question that should not pose major problems finding answers for, but again, you would want to ensure that you'll use the STAR method to present it. And of course, since you're preparing for a finance role, your communication skills should be your strength. So if you find that the best way to communicate it would be in 2 minutes or less, then you should definitely do this with quantifiable information and so on. The second category here, it's about being results oriented. Provide an experience that demonstrates your ability to manage time effectively. What were the challenges and the results? Right? So, a time when you manage time effectively, where you save time, ideally. Or share an example of when you established and accomplished a goal that was personally challenging. What helped you succeed? So again, this is, about result orientation here. So I find, again, these are pretty standard questions, but notice, the way they are framed can be quite interesting. And some people prefer to take notes during the actual interview and to note down these questions themselves, especially to avoid forgetting them, simply because, they have this formulation. Next category, about work ethics and quality in general. Provide an example when your ethics were tested. And especially if we're talking about finance role and senior finance roles, you'd want to prepare an example of this, because this actually reminds me of candidates that I coached in the past, coming from some pretty impressive companies, American companies, but the work ethics in those large companies were not that great as the work ethics of the companies that they were applying to. And the thing is that these companies that you're applying for, they know very well that the work ethics are very different in other places, and they're receiving a steady stream of candidates from those companies, so they will specifically test you on this. So that's why you would want to ensure very clearly that you fit into the culture of the company that you're applying for, because otherwise they will reject you, because that's what they're most afraid of. Because let's be clear here, if they screen you from your CV, it means you do have the skills required to do the job. So it's more about the details. And the second, a time when you had to make trade-offs between quality and cost. This is one you'd want to take also a closer look to, because trade-offs between quality and cost can be at times trickier. And I remember many times that people cut corners on cost rather than on quality. So again, the category of these questions is work ethics and quality, so it should go without saying. But needless to say, it will be very interesting for you to find an example here. Next category, a time when you disagreed with your boss on something significant. All right, so the employer will ask you these questions to see your backbone, to see how you disagree with your manager. Now, the most common pitfall here is either you haven't had major disagreements, so you're not truthful about these things, either you put the blame on your boss, which can also be a quite a temptation in many cases, and definitely something you would want to be careful of. Judgment and analysis. Share an experience in which your ability to consider the costs or benefits of a potential action help you to choose the most appropriate action. Right? So this is a standard finance role type of question. So I believe that the challenge here is to find the best one. How do you show customer obsession? So needless to say, this is about working with customers. And customer obsession is something that, for example, at Amazon is something that they put a lot of emphasis on. At Google, they don't. At Apple, they do. So it varies very much by company. How do you define customer obsession? So the trick here is to see where you want to go with this, with the best possible example of customer obsession, and then find the best story that you have to exhibit a star answer for this question. And now I'm going to give you 5 questions about interpersonal and trust in general. Describe a time when you successfully persuaded another person to change his or her way of thinking or behavior. So when you convince someone of something, so why is this about trust? Because the easiest way to convince someone of anything is to earn their trust first. So they will do whatever you want them to do. So this is also something related to listening skills. Name a time when your advice to management led to an improvement in your company or otherwise helped your employer, right? So when your advice to management led to an improvement, when you made a difference in a situation. Share an experience in which you presented to a group. What was the situation? How did it go? Right, so presentations, regardless of the data that you're presenting, is also about interpersonal, about trust. If you don't earn your group's trust, they won't follow you. So that's why this presentation thing is also about interpersonal skills. Describe a time when you found it difficult to work with someone from a different background. Right, so this is a pretty standard question for roles that are expected to interface with various other titles from completely different backgrounds. So definitely a scenario you'd want to take seriously. And a time when you disagreed with your manager, right? So here it's a bit linked with the previous question that I said, the time when you disagreed on something significant, right? When you had a major disagreement, but still a time when you disagree with your manager is also about your interpersonal skills with them. The next group here, about dealing with ambiguity. Tell me how you organize, plan, and prioritize your work. Right? So why would someone ask you, how do you plan and organize, prioritize your work? And why do I say it's related with ambiguity? I say it's related with ambiguity because this is a general type of question that's an entry point for a longer conversation that usually they want to see your thought process. And there's various ways to go about this. So some people prefer to answer these open-ended questions with rather open-ended short answers, like I do this and that, or it depends on the situation and everything else, or something else. But and other people prefer to give specific examples from the beginning. Like, for example, I remember something quite interesting that happened 2 weeks ago, and they would give a star answer. Both of these are fine to the extent that you understand what they're after. So even if you give them only a rather vague answer, which usually employers do not prefer in a behavioral interview, because that's the definition of behavioral interviewing. They look at your past behavior to predict your future performance. But even if you only give them an answer such like their question was, how do you organize and prioritize your work, then it will be a starting point for a larger conversation. What you should prepare here yourself for is, what's your management style? How do you prioritize stuff? How do you deal with ambiguity? To be clear. So that's why I asked it here. Or they could simply ask you, how do you deal with ambiguity? Right? So this is again a very open-ended question and more likely to get asked for more senior roles. So that's why you would want to take a deep dive, about how do you run things, and find something specific to yourself. Because if I give you what others say here, believe me, you get on a path that's not you, that's not your true self. And especially for finance roles, especially for more senior types of roles, these employers will will bring in their best interviewers, and if they do so, they will smell you if you don't have the example that characterizes you. A time when you came up with an interesting metric to improve something. So this is about your ability to be inventive here, but also to be noted here that usually those metrics are fueled with data. So a time when you came up with an interesting metric to improve something. Depending on your type of role, depending on your seniority of role, depending on how much you work with data per se, you will find the best possible answer here. But this is also a pretty standard question. A time when you use data to make your point, right? So a time when you use data to convince someone. So of course, they are looking about how you use data, as in the previous example, but also to be noted here that data is usually only half of the story, right? So this story is also very much about interpersonal skills. So working with data on one hand, you look at the data, or you have your team who looks at the data for you. You build up some interesting metrics, but then when you present it, then you listen carefully in order to earn their trust and eventually convince them that this is the algorithm. And employers have become very picky with the types of examples they like best, simply because they could ask you this question specifically to test your interpersonal skills, not to test your ability to use data here. So it could be a type of question that you cannot read from the beginning. Adaptability. Everyone starts somewhere. Talk about the time when you were new on the job and had a lot to learn. How did you manage that? Right. So everyone has their own experience. I believe the main challenge here is to remember a proper example here. Next, the bias for action. Provide a time when you worked in a rapidly evolving workplace. How did you deal with a change? Right. So a rapidly evolving environment or workplace, and basically, that they want to see how you move, how you work under pressure, and your bias for action after all. Or when you took a risk in a fast-paced project. Again, this is about your bias for action, but notice here the link to a risk. So the risk is also something you would want to consider preparing for quite thoroughly for a finance role. And here are a couple of more examples. A time when you took a risk and failed. This is a one that I heard quite a lot in job interviews for more senior roles. Risk-taking is something that not many people are familiar talking about, and you should definitely picture yourself, or where do you see yourself in this risk-taking environment, and prepare stories about risk. A time when you failed on something significant. Now, the previous one was a time when you took a risk and failed, and this one is a time when you failed on something significant. So both of these is about your ability to have a sound thought process, to be right a lot in general. So this is why they are somewhat linked, by your ability to be right a lot as a great leader, but also, about risk. And finally, are you a risk taker? Right. So when you're talking about risk, you should define how you address those risks, and of course, trust implications, because this is mainly a behavioral interview. But again, I've been here through most of the questions. I only have one more section left, but I've been presenting you these questions from the least to the most asked, and questions about risk are one of the most commonly asked questions for finance roles. So that's why you should be really careful with them. And finally, the general types of questions that they are getting asked both in the phone and in the on-site interviews. And the two most common of them are, why do you want to work for this company? And tell me about yourself. So these are pretty standard questions, the general ones. So I've done plenty of videos on how do you approach them, and I'm sure as someone working in finance, you'll be quite familiar with these rather standard procedures to introduce yourself. But these would be the main topics you would want to cover in a training for a finance role, applying for a finance role with a high-performing company, based on my experience. And of course, you have these questions as well in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.